Jim has said that this was like nothing he had ever seen before, and to this day, I mean, obviously we can have a debate about secret prototype spy planes and drones, and sure thing, there'll be things out there that you won't see publicly declared for 10, 15 years, but the Rendlesham Forest incident occurred over 30 years ago, and to this day, Jim is absolutely steadfast in saying, well, there's nothing that can come close to this in terms of what it looks like, but specifically the maneuvers it did. And this thing was on the ground. Jim shot off a number of photographs of this. He was subsequently told by the base processing lab that his film didn't come out. Maybe there was radiation, maybe the bright light did something, maybe whatever. He was told the film was fogged. Whether you believe that or not, I don't know. But Jim then had the presence of mind after he'd shot off the whole roll of film to take out his police notebook. And he just, started making sketches, documenting some thoughts, some observations. He sketched the craft, and he sketched strange symbols on the side of the craft. And just to show you what this thing looked like. Oh, well, there we are. That's a sketch that Jim made. This is from his original police notebook. This is a sketch of the craft, and you can see what he tried to do was sketch it from the side, kind of from back, and slightly disconcerting, a sketch of the craft from above. Now this has led to the question, well, Jim, how would you have seen it from above? And this takes us to some fairly potentially disquieting areas that maybe Jim's not too comfortable with in speculating about. But well, that's what it looked like. And John Burroughs just saw a bright flash of light and kind of hit the deck. Jim said he saw John go down. He thought he was a casualty. John doesn't quite recollect it this way. And one of the other witnesses said, well, John, I saw you, and this is the phrase, and it's a really striking one. John, I saw you go into the light. And again, where was John during all this? Why are John's memories slightly different from Jim's? It's like all these people went into the forest and encountered this. All of them came back with slightly different kind of recollections and experiences. For people who initially speculated that this was some kind of bizarre hoax, or, I've kind of come across in my government UFO work a few hoaxes, and what I tend to find is that when you're dealing with a hoax, everyone's kind of colluded and collaborated on the story, and the story's exactly the same. When you get these real incidents, well, people are people, they're individuals, they remember things different way, they perceive things different way. In a real story, you do get the differences. There are a number of other reasons why this is clearly not a hoax, and I'll come on to the physical evidence in a minute. But just to show you, this is Jim's sketch from his police notebook of the craft. He also saw along the side of this thing strange symbols on the hull. And I mean, I use the word hull because, come on, this isn't aircraft lights or weather balloon. This is a craft, and these are the symbols that Jim saw. And this thing was on the ground, and Jim, as he made his way along, he touched these symbols, and kind of when he touched the last one, it was like suddenly the flash of light, and he thought, uh-oh. And the UFO gradually ascended vertically, very, very slowly. It cleared the canopy. This was a very small clearing. The trees were maybe 30, 40, 50 feet high. Somewhere, yeah, between that and maybe even taller. When the UFO had cleared the treetops, it suddenly accelerated away at high speed. And Jim just, you know, like a lot of these military witnesses that I've interviewed in my government UFO work, this is a guy who saw fast jets on an almost daily basis. And again, he said the speed, the acceleration here is just orders of magnitude above anything he'd seen. And he wrote in his police notebook the simple phrase, speed impossible, because he didn't know what else to say about this. Now, they had some other sightings of the object in the distance, and they attempted to pursue it again. They were not successful. They didn't get close to it again. They went back to the base, and I don't have time to speculate too much about this, but when they got back, they found that there were, you know, the whole base was in a state of panic. And the reason was that they had been gone for longer than they were aware. And there was a discrepancy in the wristwatches, and it appeared that both John and Jim had been out there for 45 minutes longer than they were aware. And they were about to send other patrols out to investigate. So, you know, I don't have time to really speculate about that time difference, but certainly those people that look at the whole alien abduction mystery and its interface with the wider UFO phenomenon will be familiar with this concept of missing time. And again, you probably spotted that I was hinting at that when I talked about how the heck would Jim have a view of the top of the craft? How did he get that perspective? So it's one of many areas with this case that as more and more witnesses come forward, investigations are still ongoing. Now, once they got back to base, they were debriefed about this, and again, there are lots of allegations made about the aggressive debriefing that some of these people who were involved in this underwent. I'll maybe come back and touch on that, but I want to just stay in sequence for the moment and say that there was a second night of activity involving bee flight. And few of these bee flight personnel are on the record, but there are a couple of them that did go on the record. And again, what transpired in the second night is that strange lights were seen, and again, a military vehicle with a patrol of cops went out there to look at this. And at one point on the second night, apparently a ball of light, small ball of light, passed through the open window on one side of the cab, shot in front of the two people who were up front, and exited the open window at the other side of the cab, causing the lieutenant to be so shocked and distressed that they were subsequently had to be taken off duty. And there were several witnesses to this. There was the lieutenant, a sergeant, and a whole bunch of other airmen and airwomen who were there at the time. The third night of activity was kind of, in a sense, the icing on the cake. And what happened there was that there was an awards ceremony going on at Woody's Bar, and the senior, the base commander and the deputy base commander were essentially just about to present a whole bunch of prizes to various people for the year's performance. And suddenly, Colonel Ted Conrad was the base commander. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt was the deputy base commander. They were kind of getting their notes together. And Bruce England, the lieutenant in charge of security and policing, came up, and he said, you know, he was white as a sheet. He saluted and he just said, "Sir, it's back." Well, they were all kind of looking confused, and it was like, "What's back?" Bruce England said, "The UFO, sir. The UFO has come back." Well, Conrad and Holt kind of thought, well, you know, we've got to do something about this, and rank having its privileges, Colonel Conrad decided that he was going to stay in the warm and convivial atmosphere of the bar, and he would present the awards, and the Lieutenant Colonel, Charles Holt, well, he would go out into the cold December night on the East Coast, and those of you who are ex-military, who have ever been posted to any of those British bases will know that it gets pretty cold in the winter. So Colonel Holt threw together a small team of individuals to go out and, in his words, in Colonel Holt's own words, he said, "I want to go out and debunk this UFO nonsense for once and for all, so that we can put these wild rumors, which clearly, with so many people having experienced UFO sightings, sometimes up close and personal on the previous 2 nights, Colonel Holt, of course, like all the senior officers, they wanted this whole thing to go away. So Colonel Holt threw together a team of 4 or 5 people, and he went out into the forest to try and debunk all this. And to cut a long story short, he was not able to debunk this because he ended up encountering the UFO himself. I'll get to that, but I just back up a little while and say that one of the things that Colonel Holt wanted to do to get to the bottom of this is he wanted to light up the forest and flush out anything that was there. He said, if there's something going on, I want to put so much light out there that we'll flush it out. And what he did is he ordered that a whole bunch of light-alls be driven out there. Now, light-alls are basically powerful banks of lights mounted on the back of a flatbed or a truck, and they're used a lot in things like aircraft maintenance in the hangars. You put you shine a lot of light on those dark, difficult to access spaces so that the mechanics can get in there. And Holt's idea was to light up the forest with these light-alls and see what was out there. So he'd ordered that this happen, and then, you know, just like the radios, the light-alls suddenly started to splutter and die. You know, all these lights were going out, and Holt was getting pretty bad-tempered, and he was screaming into the radio and giving orders left, right, and center. And again, like the radios, the people I've spoken to who were familiar with these things said that they at Bentwaters and Woodbridge, they were well serviced. They'd never seen anything like this before. It's like, you know, it's like, are they not fueled up properly or something? So they were refueled, they were sent out, but they kept malfunctioning. And again, it was as if, I try not to make too many assumptions in this. When I was investigating UFOs for the Ministry of Defense, our policy was always to try and not be conclusion-led in our investigations, to go where the data take you and not to make assumptions. But one can't help on occasion, I mean, you know, it's just human nature to assume that when the radios start malfunctioning, when the films, you know, the cameras don't work, when the light-alls don't work, it's like a string of events which stretch credulity a little too much in suggesting that this is just coincidence or bad luck. All these things, sometimes in intelligence, again, anyone with a background in intelligence will know that very often, you know, it's not quite like you see in the movies, but a lot of intelligence work is looking at data and finding patterns, doing trend analysis, trying to put together a picture of what you think is going on so you can brief senior commanders. And so while Holt was waiting for the Lightalls to be you know, refueled and for them to be functioning, he thought, well, we might as well go to the site of the encounter on the first night and see if we can see anything. And I mentioned the fact that there was physical evidence. And by the way, I'll back up one more time to say that on the first night, just at the time when the UFO was first seen, it later emerged that radar bases in the UK and indeed civilian air traffic control briefly tracked what was referred to either as an uncorrelated target or in military parlance a bogey. So an unknown radar target directly over the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge, right when the people said, you know, we're seeing these strange lights. And what happened was it was there for 2 or 3 sweeps of the radar and then it disappeared. Now, did it kind of cloak itself somehow, go into stealth mode? Or did it disappear because that's the point at which it actually landed and it dropped below the radar coverage? I don't know the answer to that. But I throw out the question for what it's worth. And I apologize, by the way, if my voice is a bit croaky. I've been hit with some bug. It wasn't the government trying to silence me. You know, if it was, they would have probably done a better job than that. And anyway, I used to work for them, so what the hell? The men in black are my friends. So Colonel Holt, you know, so yeah, the UFO was briefly tracked on radar. Did it disappear because it was stealthy or because it landed or both? I don't know. So fast forwarding again to Colonel Holt and his team, they come to the clearing where John Burroughs and Jim Penniston encountered this UFO on the first night. And what they find, the first thing they notice is that there are 3 indentations on the ground, right in the center of the clearing, exactly at the point where John and Jim said, well, that's where the UFO was kind of sitting, probably like on legs. If you look at this thing, it doesn't look a million miles similar from the sort of space probes that we've sent to Mars and the Moon. You know, a kind of high-tech lunar landing module or something like that. And they said, yeah, this thing seemed to be on legs or some sort of tripod-like device. Again, interesting, I'm probably kind of poaching on Jim Mars's territory a little bit, but isn't it interesting how the number 3 and triangles and pyramids run through a lot of this? I mean, the UFO on 3 legs, the indentations, when they plotted them out, formed the shape of a triangle. And of course, when you look at these symbols, the big symbol, the big one, the one that caused the UFO to light up and then it took off when Jim touched it, was this one at the bottom, the circle, the circles and the triangle in the other circle. And again, like I say, I'm probably encroaching onto Jim's territory a little, but I know there are a bunch of people interested in the symbolism of this. Is it occult symbolism? Is it, you know, one can draw parallels throughout history with the number 3. I mean, my goodness, you know, the Trinity. Again, but that's probably somebody else's presentation. It's not mine. I just throw it out there as food for thought. So when Colonel Holt and his team see these 3 indentations, it's kind of like the validation that, yeah, well, you know, there was something there right where John and Jim said there was on that first night. And the other point, I mentioned a few moments ago that it's pretty darn cold in the UK in winter. The ground was really hard and frozen. And Colonel Holt speculated, estimated that this object, whatever it is, to make those indentations with the ground being as hard as it was, would have made several tons. And part of the investigation later consisted of, it sounds pretty low tech, but actually it was quite clever, pouring plaster of Paris into the indentations and then taking a mold of what they look like to actually get a reconstruction of the landing legs of this craft. One of those molds subsequently disappeared, but I believe that either Colonel Holt or Jim Penniston still have one of them. So there is some physical evidence out there that the government didn't manage to get. Maybe they got the other one. So Colonel Holt, having gone out thinking this was all nonsense, this is obviously a little bit disconcerting. And even more disconcerting was what happened next, because one of the people in his team was the disaster preparedness officer, Munro Nevels. And Munro Nevels had with him a Geiger counter. And Colonel Holt said, well, go around the clearing and take some readings. So Nevels got out the Geiger counter and he started poking around, and when he got to the 3 indentations, suddenly he started getting some clicks. And then, and those clicks peaked right in the indentations and in the center of this, where this thing would have come down. And then they kind of looked around, and they had flashlights with them. I was going to say they have torches. Us Brits call, yeah, it's like, I've given this presentation in America before, and I've said, and they had their torches with them, and people have said, what, these guys were carrying torches? Were they nuts? And I suddenly realized that, oh, you guys, what you call a flashlight, we call a torch. You know, what is it they say? 2 countries divided by a common language. It's a good job that they didn't stop for a cigarette break, because the British slang for a cigarette is a fag. Anyway, Colonel Holt and his team had flashlights with them, and they were able to see that the sides of the trees in this clearing were all kind of scorched and burnt and blackened. And so Munro Nevels put his Geiger counter on the sides of the trees, and again got peak readings from those trees, but not from the other side of the trees. The physically visible burn marks and indeed the high levels of radioactivity were only on the inward facing side of the trees. So where this thing was in the center of the clearing, and whatever it is had nearly burnt down those trees and had caused radioactivity levels to spike, but not on the other sides. And of course all of this was documented, and later, when the data were sent to the British Ministry of Defence, the Defence Intelligence Staff, an ultra-secretive part of the Ministry of Defence, whose role in UFO research and investigation was only made public very much later, and was certainly not something that I was able to talk about at the time. But these scientific and technical intelligence specialists assessed the radioactivity levels reported by Munro Nevels and Colonel Holt, and said that they were about 7.5 times higher than the average background. And there is I mean, the great thing about this case, and I don't have slides because documents, you know, from the Ministry of Defence don't tend to kind of reproduce very well, but the great thing about this case is that we don't just have on-the-record testimony from people like Colonel Holt, though I think that having on-the-record testimony from you know, the Deputy Base Commander is pretty good in the scheme of things. But we don't just have that, we have an audit trail of government documents. And unlike some of the documents over here, there's no debate about the authenticity of these documents. You can read them on the National Archives website as part of the wider collection of Ministry of Defence UFO files. And one of the documents is the original Defence Intelligence Staff assessment, and it uses the phrase significantly higher than the average background when it talks about these levels of radioactivity. So they saw the marks in the ground, they saw the burn marks on the trees, they saw the levels on the radioactivity, you know, they saw the radiation levels. They took samples of soil, they took samples of sap from the trees, along with control samples from outside of the clearing and from trees that were not affected in this way. Much of that material subsequently disappeared. For anyone who thinks that, and you know, one of the other documents in the British file on this incident says that shortly after the sightings occurred, General Gabriel visited the base, was briefed on this, and took various items of evidence back to his headquarters in Ramstein, Germany. Who was General Gabriel? General Gabriel was Commander-in-Chief, United States Air Force in Europe. He was the senior USAF officer in Europe. Why was the senior general in Europe flying in specially to Bentwaters and Woodbridge in the immediate aftermath of this, being briefed about this, taking these items back to his headquarters, and why don't we know about this? And wait a minute, if you ask the government about this, isn't the official line supposed to be that UFOs are no longer of any interest to the US government and no investigations have been undertaken since Project Blue Book was terminated at the end of 1969? That's the official line, isn't it? Well, if that's true, why is CNC USAFE flying in and being briefed about a UFO sighting? So, again, food for thought. To get back to Colonel Holt and his team in the clearing, at that point, something happens, and one of the men shouts out, "Sir, over, you know, it's back, it's back." And Holt is like, "What?" And it's like, "Through the trees, look, over there." And sure enough, through the trees, Colonel Holt saw this strange light. And I don't have it as part of my presentation, but for those of you who have not come across this, go onto YouTube and just search on the phrase Holt tape. And it's H-A-L-T, by the way, not H-O-L-T. And Colonel Holt, and by the way, the reason this is on tape is that as the deputy base commander, just like Special Agent Dale Cooper in Twin Peaks, and how cool is it that that's coming back on TV? Colonel Holt habitually carried with him a handheld cassette recorder on which to document his observations and thoughts. So all this is on tape, and if you put the phrase Holt tape into YouTube, you can listen to this, and you can listen to the actual voice of Charles Holt and some of the other people who are out there. You can hear them saying, hey, get the Geiger counter on that. Hey, we're getting clicks. So all this is kind of on audio tape, which is quite fun. It's 17 minutes long. They were actually out there for 3 or 4 hours, but Colonel Holt wasn't recording all the time. And there are allegations that there are other parts of the tape that have yet to be made public. But you suddenly hear, they're saying it's coming this way, it's coming this way. No doubt about it, this is weird. And you can hear the fear and tension in these men's voices as this thing comes closer and closer. And at one point, this thing is moving around rapidly in the sky, conducting what Holt said reminded him in a way of a grid search. And then, at the climax of this encounter, this object is almost directly overhead and fires a narrow, pencil-thin beam of light down that strikes the ground just feet in front of them. And again, for those of you who heard my presentation yesterday where I briefly mentioned a case from the UK in 1993, you'll know that this idea of UFOs firing these narrow beams of light is something that comes up quite a lot in some of the most compelling incidents that we have. And so the beam of light hits the ground just in front of Colonel Holt and his men, and looking back on it now, Colonel Holt has speculated, and he said, you know, was this a weapon? Was this a warning? Was this communication? What was this? He didn't know. The beam retracted. They saw all sorts of strange activity, multiple objects in the sky. They didn't get as close as John and Jim on the first night, so they didn't really get details. But again, Holt and the other witnesses that I've interviewed about this say that these speeds and maneuvers just went above and beyond anything we've even got now. And these people have a pretty good idea of what technology is out there, be it friendly, you know, US or UK, allied nations in NATO, or unfriendly. And again, you know, when people say the speeds, the maneuvers, the acceleration, unreal, you know, would have killed any human occupant, for example, the sort of G-forces that would have been involved in the turns that these things were performing. I mean, you know, again, it all, I think, makes one wonder, what are we dealing with here? And so the last thing that you hear on the Holt tape is they'd gone off the base out into the forest, they'd crossed a farmer's field, and they were then looking back. All the time they were pursuing these UFOs, and at one point, like I say, it was directly overhead. And then the very final thing is they say the UFO is back kind of where they started. It's firing light beams down at Woodbridge Base. And you know, I don't have time to get into any of this, but it's a case that's covered on the new series UFOs Declassified that's going to be coming here to Smithsonian Channel fairly soon. Look out for an episode called Red Alert, which is going to get into that. It's on a number of other TV shows too. Many of you will know there's lots of speculation about the particular area of the base that these light beams actually struck and impacted. It was an area which was What I can say is it's part of the weapons storage area. What I can say is it was nicknamed Hot Row for some inexplicable reason that I couldn't possibly comment on. Obviously, there is speculation about the nuclear question. I am still bound by the Official Secrets Act. I can neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons at those bases at the time, but there are plenty of other people out there, some of whom were posted there, who are apparently a bit more free and easy about what they say, so, you know, good luck to them. But again, I throw that out, and even though I have to say neither confirm nor deny, I mean, I think you can begin to piece together maybe the story that's unfolding here when we talk about the light beams impacting this most critical area within these twin bases. Well, that was the 3 nights of activity. There were subsequent allegations which Colonel Holt has validated, that unmarked aircraft flew in and out, and strange personnel, often civilians just in suits, were kind of walking in, walking around. They were accessing all areas. They were maybe flying things back. They were interrogating some of the witnesses, maybe even threatening them. Colonel Holt has gone on the record to say that several young airmen under his command were harshly interrogated with both drugs and hypnosis being used. You know, if this sort of allegation just turned up anonymously on the internet, that's one thing. When the former deputy base commander of 2 of the most strategically important bases in the entire NATO alliance goes on the record to say that this happened, I think in evidential terms that takes it to an entirely different level. And I mean, I think stuff like that, you can take it to the bank. So there were allegations of threats. The phrase "bullets are cheap," yeah, they're a dime a dozen, was heard by several people apparently present at a briefing when they were told not to talk about any of their UFO experiences. And it's only really with now the British government declassifying its files, some of the Blue Book files being more accessible, that maybe the full story will come out. Some people are talking, some are still saying, I'm not going to discuss that. One aspect of the case which I did not mention at the time, but of course it's something which is very controversial at the moment, is the so-called binary message, or the Rendlesham Code. Now, I mentioned that when Jim Penniston touched these symbols, particularly with the last one, the whole thing lit up. What he kept to himself for many years was that when he touched that craft and there was this bright flash of light, he received what he could only describe as a telepathic download. And some days later, he was sitting at home, and again, he said, as if he was under a compulsion, he reached for his notebook and he wrote out 16 pages of ones and zeros, and then promptly put the whole thing away and didn't really think much about it for years. And when I've spoken to him about this, he said, yeah, it's kind of like he didn't really know what he was doing. It was under a compulsion. He didn't know that it was necessarily important. Well, of course, needless to say, when people in the UFO community first saw this and saw it in the police notebook, just kind of tucked away after these sketches, people thought, well, what the heck's this? And when he explained the backstory, that he received this kind of download, people reached out to computer programmers, and I know that there was one called Nick Sisk who had a look at this for a TV production company that was looking at this case. And there is a translation of this so-called binary message, and the translation reads as follows: exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance, eyes of your eyes, origin year 8100. Now, origin year 8100, does that mean, as some people speculate, that we're dealing not with extraterrestrial visitation, but in this case with time travel? Or does it mean, I mean, again, I think Jim Mars mentioned a case this morning involving missing time, and Jim certainly said that in you know, the hundreds of people that have come to him with encounters of not just UFOs but alien abductions, this whole issue of missing time throws up the question of time travel. So are we dealing with human time travelers from the future? Are we dealing with extraterrestrials who can manipulate space-time? Remember that space and time in terms of physics are actually viewed as a single entity, space-time. Again, I don't know, but for anyone that thinks this is science fiction, look at the work, for example, being done by Professor Ronald Mallett. Again, look up that name, Ronald Mallett, a professor who's looking at time travel quite seriously. Look at, for those of you who think that things like other dimensions is science fiction. Yeah, sure, a few years ago it would have been. But now look at the sorts of experiments that are planned at the Large Hadron Collider, where it's believed that some of the string theory that you hear about actually only works in terms of theoretical physics if there are a number of so-called hidden dimensions. And it may be this year, as the Large Hadron Collider powers up to unimaginable levels of power that have not previously been reached, that we perhaps draw aside the curtain of mystery and get a peek into the most dark and mysterious secrets of the universe. So, you know, extraterrestrials, time travel, other dimensions, all these things that a few years ago skeptics scoffed at and scientists maybe thought, well, I don't want to do that. Now they're doing it, and it's happening right now. A postscript to the story of Jim touching the side of the craft is that both John and Jim, oh, and by the way, back to that message, exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance, eyes of your eyes, origin year 8100. As well as that, there were a series of coordinates, latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates, which when they were plotted out just so happened to coincide with some of the most mysterious and sacred sites from humanity's past. The Great Pyramids at Giza, the Temple of Apollo on the island of Naxos in Greece, the Nazca Lines in Peru, the mysterious lost continent of High Brazil, which is sometimes dubbed the Celtic Atlantis. Is it coincidence that all of these sacred sites are kind of cropping up in the Rendlesham message? Or is it part of a hidden meaning? Again, for those of you who are fans of the ancient astronaut, ancient alien theory, the idea is not just that some of humanity's ancient gods were extraterrestrials, but now the idea is that these gods may be returning. And again, some of the ancient texts talk about the return of the ancient gods. And now we get the Rendlesham message, the so-called binary code, whatever you describe it at. Again, does this mean that we're building up to something? Again, I throw it out there. John and Jim the ones who got closest to this have medical problems, which they attribute to their proximity to the craft. They are not able to access their military medical records, which are apparently lodged in a little-known classified section of the Veterans Administration, where normally people who are involved in special forces operations, where their records are sent. Well, you know, why are the two witnesses, the two main witnesses to the Rendlesham Forest incident, why are their medical records still not able to be obtained? Last year there was an event called the Citizen Hearing on Disclosure. I don't know how many of you heard about this, but this was a private initiative to say that if Congress won't do its job, we, the people, will do it for them. And Steve Bassett and his Paradigm Research Group put on an event where basically some retired Congress people, some Republican, some Democrat, some Libertarian, came together to hold the sorts of hearings on UFOs that many people believe should be held. And you'll see John and Jim in the middle there, their attorney on the right, who has helped them pro bono, Pat Frascogna, great guy, who has given hours and hours of pro bono work to try and help John and Jim obtain their medical records. I'm there on the left. The former Congress people who were there were so outraged by the inability of John and Jim to access their military medical records that they wrote about this directly to the Secretary of the VA and to the President of the United States, to ask that these men who had given so much loyal military service for their country be given what's due to them, so that their doctors can make a proper diagnosis and a proper treatment plan. To date, these medical military records have yet to be forthcoming. Work on that is ongoing. Work on the Rendlesham Code is still ongoing. An esoteric researcher in England called Gary Osborne is doing a lot of work. A retired US Air Force a guy called Joe Luciano is doing a lot of work. You know, this is a continuing story, and we're trying to get to the bottom of these issues. We're trying to get more witnesses to come forward. I apologize for having encroached a little bit onto the break time, but I was told that I could do that because I'm not encroaching on Jim's time, which I won't do. But I will wrap up now because I see him staring menacingly at me. And with that, I will just thank you very much for listening. Sadly, I don't actually have any copies of my own book. There may be some kicking around somewhere. It's been out in hardback for a while. It comes out in trade paperback, I think, on March the 3rd. But if there's been a little bit too much, you know, names and, you know, locations, all of the information is in the book, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. I co-wrote it with John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, and even their attorney, Pat Frascogna, put in a chapter on the multiple FOI requests that are ongoing. So we've told the story in that book, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. There's lots of TV shows on this. I think this does indeed constitute a case that justifies its nickname of Britain's Roswell. It wasn't a crash, but in terms of everything that makes a UFO case compelling, multiple witnesses, military witnesses, radar, physical trace evidence in terms of burn marks on the trees, indentations in the ground, radioactivity levels, and an audit trail of government documents that say, yeah, this is exactly what happened. All those things come together in this one incident. It's why I sometimes call it a perfect storm when it comes to a UFO case. So I think my voice has just about held out. I'm very grateful to the conference organizers for giving me this time, and I'm very grateful for you for having turned up to listen. I hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.